In this guide, I'm going to be creating a mega nav menu that's kind of unorthodox to, I'd say, the Tailwind CSS worlds. When you use, I guess, the tooling for Tailwind CSS, you're going to have all these utility-based classes that go on your HTML. Looks like what you'd see in this screenshot here. Looks a little cumbersome at first, but once you start using it, you'll see why a lot of people are adopting it now. The inspiration mostly lies from the folks at Stripe. They pretty much push the boundaries on things. This menu is going to use more CSS and probably some JavaScript than I'm going to use, and that's okay to me because I don't want to reach for actually writing custom CSS in this guide. I want to try to use at least as much as I can from Tailwind CSS to give you the similar qualities you get from this menu. There are going to be some obviously differences and just not as much, I guess, attention to detail simply because the time involved, and then I don't have all these icons that are custom like they do. They have a whole team dedicated probably like just this, front page and their marketing pages. So that said, what I'm going to end up building is something like this. I called it pipe for short, but the idea is you have this menu. This is all Tailwind CSS. So underneath the hood, we've got a basic two nav structure. There's a nav element here and a nav element here for the sign in button. I'm mimicking kind of what they're doing here. Obviously, it's not the same verbatim, but it is close. So the idea is you'd hover over these states. You'd kind of have the different look and feel per menu. I didn't reach for icons simply because of time and just, it's more of a aesthetic you can add later. It's not really complicated to do, but it is something you could add to definitely increase the UI here and make it look a little more fancy. But in this guide, I'm going to show you just pretty much walking you through how to do this and how you can use Tailwind specifically to do such a thing. To kick things off, though, I am going to use a new little framework for the front end just to make my life easier. You don't have to use this at all. You can use the Tailwind Playground even if you want to. Totally up to you. I like to use this since I prefer my code editor and not really coding in the browser myself. So what I'll do is actually kick things off and install this with you. You don't have to do this. Like I said, I have this server running here. It's a nice little front-end tool stack that I like to use. You'll need Yarn, of course, to start and Node.js. So if you have those things installed, you'll be set. And you can actually use Yarn to kick off the Vite setup. I think it's called Vite for short. I'm not 100%. I used to call it something else. But anyway. Let's create a new project. If you just kick this off in like your code directory like I have here, you could just say yarn create Vite, and it actually has a step-by-step guide to kind of walk you through what kind of package you might want to do. And you'll see this little prompt here to say what project name you want to do. So I'll say Tailwind CSS mega menu, something like that. And I'm going to use just vanilla JS. The unique thing about Vite is your ability to use either, some sort of React solution, Vue solutions, Svelte. Apparently Lit is one. I don't even know. I'm not much of a JavaScript guy, but I do enjoy some of the tooling they do have opposed to like the old school Webpack that we used to have of yesteryear. I don't really write much TypeScript either, but you can feel free to try that if you want to. I'm just going to stick with vanilla for now. We really won't be using JavaScript like at all. I'm just using it for the post CSS capabilities mostly. So in the guide, once you're running this like you have here, you'll want to cd into your project. In this case, I've called it that. You want to install your dependencies by running yarn. You could also use npm if you want to. I'm keeping this very simple on purpose. And then yarn dev will kick off the server, which is this link here. I'm in iTerm 2, so if I hit command on my Mac and click, I can go straight to it. And then the default scaffolding for the Vite app is just a counter showing you what's capable of. So that's one step, the first step anyway, of getting this going. I, of course, need Tailwind CSS to start too. I'm going to go about that a little bit differently than the guide suggests. So go to docs, and it actually has a Vite specific one here. Very opinionated towards Vue users though, so I would take this with a grain of salt. We've already done this part here, but we do need to install Tailwind CSS, post CSS, and auto prefixer. So I'll actually use yarn in my case. So I say yarn add Tailwind CSS, post CSS, and auto prefixer. These are all just dependencies of Tailwind, of course, with Tailwind itself. -D will mean it's a dev dependency as opposed to a normal dependency. So you want to have that in your arsenal there. But I'll go fetch everything we need and all the dependencies involved. And then you can actually you can either use npx, I think you could do yarn as well. Yarn, Tailwind, CSS, init p. This will create two files. The first being the Tailwind configuration file. And if you see the CJS, it's common JS. Depending on your setup, you might have just JS, and that's totally fine. You can ignore it pretty much. And then post CSS is going to be what's really responsible for compiling Tailwind down to normal CSS in the end. So our utility classes and component classes and all that actually render correctly in the browser. So with that installed, hopefully that wasn't too fast. Might be. If it is, just go back through. I do this all the time, so I might be a little too quick with that explanation. These are kind of crucial steps to get Tailwind working. So we won't need to change anything to do with the post CSS configuration file. The Tailwind configuration file comes with this setup. I'm going to actually remove this little commenting section. The content section is something we do need to add. I'm going to use basically steal from the docs here, but just manipulate it a little bit just to be not any of these other than JS, just to keep it simple. So I'll actually do that. Okay, so this essentially means, if you're new to Tailwind, this means content here will be scanned for Tailwind, and we'll like use a purge CSS kind of concept in the background that gets rid of any additional CSS you don't need, because Tailwind's huge if you don't do that step. So if you try to ship with the full Tailwind CSS library, it's going to get very hefty to load. So you want to use these tools in the actual app itself to kind of make sure it's lean as it can be. And then finally, in the index file, we can adjust that in a second. I'm going to actually get rid of the counter file and also the main.js file, or not the main.js. I'm going to undo that. Excuse me. I'm going to get rid of the JavaScript SVG. We don't need that at all. The main.js file is going to import our styles, which is what we want. Everything else here we can kind of remove. In our CSS file, I'll do the same. Remove everything in there. We can use our Tailwind directives here, paste those in, and then let's see if things work here. So we could say yarn dev. Actually, it's already running here. I'm going to reboot it and do it again. No unit. Okay, let's see. Content configuration. Turn on my formatting here. This should work. I think what I've done in the past that make this, I get this little error here, and it's, I think should honestly work now. Let's see. If that's an issue, we'll see if it renders. Let's go back to the index HTML and just render something simple for starters. Just do an h1 tag, class, text 3XL, font bold, text red 500 or 600, hello world. Does it work? It does. So all is well in this department. What I'll end up doing is just make this like a CSS mega menu, something like that. It's going to come with this Vite SVG for the icon. I'll leave that there for now if you want to change that to something on your own. But that's essentially onboarding the app to getting it ready for creating the menu that we did before. Where I'll start first after all that setup is getting the body and HTML tags in, kind of full width. So what I'll do is start with some basic styles there. On the HTML tag, I want to make sure that one's full on the height. The class on the body is going to be a big gradient class to kind of mimic what Stripe's doing here. It's nothing like, they obviously have a ton more going on. I think that's Canvas, so there's JavaScript involved there. And then all these crazy like offsets and slants and stuff. Of course, they push the boundaries. I'm not going to go too hog wild there. Maybe a future tutorial will become something we can do there. I'm not sure if Tailwind's even capable of stuff that Stripe's doing, but there probably is a future where that is possible. So let's see. We've got Vite. I'll close that tab and this tab, and this is our server running here. And we'll keep Stripe open just for reference so we can just kind of see what's going on here. I want to basically span the whole body to be a gradient. So Tailwind has gradient properties, and you can classify what color scheme you want to. And we'll say to bottom right, and you can go any which direction you prefer. This is kind of my preferred route. So we'll say from indigo 500 to pink 700, and then we'll say via blue 800. Then I'll make sure the text on the full body is anti-aliased. And we'll say BG no repeat. And text will be white throughout. That should give us the full background in this kind of nice gradient blend. You can tweak those colors all you want. There's so many colors to choose from with Tailwind, and you can honestly go through and customize those. If you ever wanted to, you could go into your Tailwind config, extend, go into colors, object, and just add additional here, or remove any should you want to. The guide, the Tailwind CSS documentation should tell you everything you need to know about doing that. So it's something to reference if you need to. Then let's do the header portion. Let's just make this simple to start. I'm going to have our basic anchor tag to the home page here. Just going to be our fictitious name that I called pipe because I couldn't think of anything better. And then we'll do a bold text with white coloring. It should already be white, but that's something we'll make sure we'll have. And the default font family of Tailwind's kind of, you know, almost similar to something that Stripe is rocking already. So that's a perk. They're using more custom fonts, I believe. So it might be a Stripe specific font. So when you're in the big times like that, you can roll your own fonts, do, you know, whatever you want, because you got so much time and money, I guess, and the bigger teams to focus on it. For the header itself, we do want to offset it to be centered on the page here. So, and then up from the top. So I'll do a little bit of fix up there. A container class is going to set up, you know, a max width with Tailwind by default. It's going to have different breakpoints, just relative to what it is supposed to be and the opinions of those that create Tailwind. I'm going to add some padding by default on the left and right, and then the top and bottom. X as for x-axis, Y as for horizontal axis. And then we'll flex everything, item center, and then justify between. So this will have a consistency of the logo, the main navigation, as you see like Stripe has, and then the sign-in action. So we'll have 3 sections in this one block. So the header itself is going to start off that way. And then we'll have 2 navs, one being the main navigation controls and the other is a sign-in. Let's start with the sign-in link. I think that'll be a little more straightforward to kick off things because the other one's pretty huge. But inside a nav, I'll use UL tag. Inside that will be list items, and we just need one here for now. So we'll say href. These won't link anywhere because this is pretty much fictitious, but it's just one of those things I wanted to be very certain of. So rounded full, and then we'll do some padding on the top and bottom. Font semi-bold. BG white, BG opacity 10. That sets that white opacity down to 10%. And then we'll flex items in the center here because we're going to add an icon, a group class as well. And I'll explain group here in a second. What I'll do first is have a span tag in the middle here. We'll do a slight margin on it to the right. And the 2 here doesn't necessarily mean like 2 pixels or anything. I think it's just a utility of measure for Tailwind that goes up in, I think, even increments with rims. So that's how the button's starting to look over there. Now, the reason I use Vite specifically is the hot module reloading. So when I save any of this stuff just updates on the fly. It's just a lot easier to do. Then below the span, we'll actually have an SVG. I could copy and paste this, but this one's relatively simple. So I'll kind of hustle through it. Current. Stroke current essentially means it's going to fill the strokes of this SVG, which is like a vector shape, with the current text color of whatever the container is, or in this case, it's inheriting from the header itself, so it should be white at this point. We'll set a width and height attribute. Now, typically, I would just copy and paste this from like a design tool or something, but I'm going to type this for now to save myself a little trouble. Width 2, which means 2 pixels. And realistically, I pretty much stole this from the sign-in button on Stripe. So if you wanted to go view source on that arrow, they have a nice little animation on it, which we'll add to, but theirs is a little nicer, I would argue. But you can go and grab the SVG element here, just hit edit as HTML and it should open it all up. In fact, I'll just do that. And then we'll go back through and finesse that. We don't want their custom classes because we're going to use Tailwind, of course. But this is how they basically controlled that animation you saw, is using those classes. So in our case, we're going to have that there. I'll do that stroke current class again. Then we can keep this G. That essentially means a grouping in a SVG. So the first path here, if we go back, it's going to be these two shapes. If you look real close, I don't know if it's easy to see or not. If I zoom in, they look like that at the moment, which isn't right, but we can tweak that. The first one, we'll set opacity to 0 and group hover. Since we set that group parameter on the link itself, we can access some stuff here. Once that's hovered, we can change some settings on the SVG, which is the nice thing I'm continually using over and over. I really enjoy that one. And then if we want to make it kind of more of a smoother animation, we can set transition classes. I'll say ease in out. And the duration will be 200. Okay, that's the first one. It should be hidden at this point, but once you hover it, it shows itself. One thing I want to change here is stroke weight. It's 2 pixels. I had to customize theirs a little bit. I think it's just stroke width, not weight. I would argue my fonts are, a little larger than Stripe's, but I think it works for what we need. So I'll keep going with it. It's less to actually code, so I'll keep it that way. This other one's going to be opacity 100. We're going to say group hover, transform, and we'll do another group hover. And this will be kind of shifting that arrow to the right a bit. So we'll say translate X1, which means it'll go to the right. And we'll do the transition bit again. Ease in out. And a duration of 200. All right. So now, once it does its trick, there's a little gap that's I don't love. Stripe's got it figured out over here. To me, it's not a huge deal since this is a demo, but it is one thing that I noticed when I was creating this initially. So you can maybe tweak that a little more if you want to. Okay, so that's the extent of that button. Obviously, that's a lot of code. If you worked on some other kind of framework or something, you might want to extract this stuff to like a helper method or something like that. All right, let's move on to the main bread and butter of this guide. Will be the big mega menu drop down nav. I should preface this all saying this isn't a responsive menu. You could extend this to be such. I just kind of, to save some time, I'm really worried about the desktop view. I think Stripe does theirs completely different on mobile anyway. Nav class here, there's going to be a set of UL lists, so unordered lists, and essentially each ULI is going to have a button that's going to have a drop down element. So I'm going to use a button just for more of a Java, like I think Stripe use it more or less for accessibility and JavaScript rendering, but for me, I'm just using it to follow their lead. We want to flex this, items center, justify center, and then font semi-bold. So I'll start with one item that'll be products. So we'll just call it products. That'll shift it to the center there. And this is centered based on the layout as we have it already. The container, the header itself is already a flex container. And then the main logo is going to be the first item. Then there'll be the third, which is going to be our big nav, and then our small nav over here. So when done correctly, this will work itself out with Flexbox. Then what I'll do is I'm going to do this kind of pattern for each button that we use. We'll just say hover, opacity is 50. I'm doing this just to simply follow Stripe's lead. For some reason, they set an opacity when you hover over the main parent nav item, so it's kind of following that lead. They also don't use like any kind of cursor, fancy cursor, so I'll say cursor default. So as you notice, it doesn't turn to a pointer or anything, it's just a mouse. Similar look and feel. Let's get one big menu item done. So inside the LI, I'm going to do everything below the button will be another container. This one will have quite a few classes just because it needs to look and feel a specific way. I'll set this one to absolute. And you notice we set the LI to relative, so it's going to absolutely position itself relative to this LI. So we'll need to tweak a few things from there. I'm going to set just like top of 0, left of 0. We'll come back and finesse those because it's going to need it based on the size of the menu. We'll do that transition class again. The LI is going to actually have a group class, and we'll set some PX, PY attributes to spread them out some as well. That gives it some cushioning between the other items, which we'll add. In fact, I'll add like the other one just to show context. I'll probably just copy this part. And this one will be solutions. So now it looks like that. In fact, we can probably just add the rest. After solutions comes developers, just following Stripe's lead here. You see here, and then resources. And finally pricing. Pricing is going to be an actual link. I don't really need a button for that, so I'll just say href and wrap that one. We won't need any kind of drop down there. And I'll get rid of this closing button tag. We'll call this one just pricing. All right, so that gives us our full like parent menu. Nothing's mega about it yet, but we're getting close. So in theory, it should like do its breakpoints thanks to the container class. Things will expand about that wide and then break down from there. You can totally take this and run with it in terms of a mobile nav. It would require a lot more code, but I left that out for now just because it's quite a bit to run through. Maybe in a future video I can do that though. All right, let's start with the first major drop-down menu. This one's going to be a two-tiered menu. It's going to have 2 columns. It's kind of like this, but without the icons. If you remember in the beginning, I kind of showed you what I did with that. We'll actually start first by using this absolute area. This div is going to be the main wrapping container. Since we have a group class in the very beginning on the LI, we can use it to do any hover effects. So I'll say translate Y5. This is basically gonna mimic how this fades in, but not quite. Obviously, Stripe has more cool CSS features and it's always visible. Ours will be close, but not quite. And that's okay to me. If you want a strictly Tailwind driven solution, this could be how you could do it. That's similar anyway. So translate Y0. Opacity will start off as 0. We'll set invisible to start, and then we'll say on group hover we'll bring the opacity back to 100, and then same with the visibility, and we'll set a kind of a longer duration so it takes a little time, more of a dramatic effect. And same with transform. We want to move the menu on hover and make sure it's really high in the z-index, because when we hover over the menu, I want it to stay open. So when my mouse is down on the menu, it shouldn't close. It's kind of a tricky thing to get right. We'll say min width. I'm going to set a custom width here because it's going to need a certain width to withhold all the content. And this is just the outside container shell, so nothing's even going to display yet. But the shell of this is going to position it in such a way that we want it so we can have our links and everything looking good. Inside here, we'll have a relative class. Start with that one. We're going to set a top, I'm going to call it 6, padding of 6, BG white, rounded XL. And shadow will be big. We'll say XL with full. So inside here, we could just have something like basic. So P class, let's say products menu just to start. Okay, so now that shows itself. The text right here is white, so it's not showing correctly, but that gives you the idea of what's going on here when you hover over it. So the big effect here is the translation effects or translate effects. So we have everything's transitioning quite slowly using the duration. And then on group hover, we're making it appear visible and opacity. And then also translating it down 5 from 0. So it essentially goes from the top down. And then Stripe has these little arrow carrots, I guess you could call them. I'm going to add that next, I think. So that's going to go inside of this div. And it's just going to be essentially a placeholder div that's going to have that carrot quality. It won't be anything too crazy, but we need to basically make it a square and turn it on its side as a trick to do it. So I'll say width and height of 10, BG white, transform, and we'll rotate it 45 degrees. Again, it needs to be absolute, and top will be 0. I think I set the Z index, to 0. This one I want to kind of move along with the menu as it appears. So a nice trick, which we can go in the other direction. Notice this one comes down. The arrow, I want to come from left to right. So when the menu comes down, I want the arrow to glide right, if that makes sense. So we'll start at translate 0, and then transition, transform, group hover. It's going back to that initial group again. This one I'll do a custom one. So translate X will be, I think I did 12 rem here. I'll need to adjust the main menu to go a little left than it should, but we'll go back and do that. So again, the same kind of ease in out pattern, and then we'll do a rounded small since this is a smaller shape. And that should kind of give it that look. So when you hover over it, see how it glides right? Now, obviously that isn't lined up where we want it. So what I need to do is actually go back to the menu here. Our left should probably be a little more negative. So looking at my notes, I have it as negative left 48. See how that looks. There we go. So now that menu lines up with that carrot. Our menu itself is this wide. We're going to have 2 columns in there, kind of similar to Stripe. Theirs is more left aligned, which is fine. I'm just kind of going a little bit different based on the location of the menu item. And then, okay, below this carrot item, we'll have the other subnav content. So it gets nested here. It's quite confusing after a while, but once you do the first one, you can kind of copy and paste your code. So I'm going to set this with a certain Z index, so it's above the content here. And inside that, I'm going to do 2 columns. So I like to use grid for that. So grid calls 2 gap. I set a 6 between them. And then within that, we'll have 2 divs. So I'll start with those. And then the first one's going to be our main product stuff. So I added a kind of a title that's going to be a fancy one. So uppercase, kind of a small caps look, if you know what that looks like. Tracking whiter. So that's skews the letters further apart. Text gray 500, font medium. And then I'll set a custom font size to 13 pixels. And you could do custom ones by wrapping whatever you want to call it in these square brackets, and it should render fine. And then inside that P tag, I just called it the suite. So then we get that look and feel. It looks cool. All right. Let's go back, and then underneath the P tag, we'll have our actual subnav. This one I'll have some offset from that other thing, or small caps. And then I'll set all these links to be 15 pixels, which is a little smaller than the default. Okay, inside each, of course, is going to be a link. It's not going to link anywhere because it's going to be a chore to kind of build all those pages, but you could do that. So these are going to be just, I styled these just how I would maybe style them. They have some padding. They're offset from the padding, so they line up with the menu titles. And then it's mostly the effects are shown on hover. So on the link itself, I'm going to call this one course editor. Inside below that, I'll just have a p tag. And I'm going to call that all in one editor. I think you need a hyphen between those, but there we go. Inside here, we'll set it to block because we want it to span the full width of the column of the grid. So since it's 2 columns, they're going to be 2 full columns. And I want these to span full width so it's easier to click on. So we'll set some padding, some negative margin on the sides. You'll see why in a second. Rounded will be pretty large. And hover, we do a BG gradient pattern to bottom right. Hover, we'll say from indigo, real light, 50. Hover to pink, 50, real light again. And then hover via blue, 50, again, real light. Again, transition, ease in out. Duration, I'd set this one to 300 instead of that 500 we've been using. And text by itself will be text gray 800. Font semi-bold for the main link text. And then we'll say hover is text indigo 600. And then the p tag, I want to style it slightly different. I'll show you what this all looks like in just a second. So text gray, maybe 500 for that one, and just font normal to make it look like a subhead. So when you hover over, and there's our first link. Now, you can see it's like divided. There's 2 columns there. So this one by itself is the first one in the chain. So we'll essentially be able to just copy and paste this part going forward. I'll just change the titles of each. So the first one, this course editor, I made this kind of about like stuff I've been doing lately is like editing course, editing video. Maybe it's like a software suite helped with the API kind of thing with integrated payments, something like that. I have no idea what it really would be, but it's all fictitious for now. Okay, and then closed captioning. Use AI to generate captions. And I think that was it for the first left-hand side. So we did 3 and 3 on this menu. So that's kind of what the look and feel is looking like. Now to get our second grid area set up, we just need to basically copy this down, all the list items. And inside the next div, I'll do a similar. Actually, I want to copy everything within this div. So UL plus the P tag and the div. Actually, sorry, from the UL to the P tag. And then I'll paste that inside here. That should give us a duplicate on the right side, and we'll just adjust the content from there. So I will go back to the first UL and close it so I don't mistake in that one. This one will be plugins. Oops, actually, this will be extensions. And then the drop down, first one will be plugins, tweak existing functionality. And then below that will be batch uploads. Get your time back. It's so generic stuff. So mostly placeholder content, just trying to make it a little realistic. Social sharing. And we'll say generate content for socials. All right, so that gives us our first mega menu drop-down area. And you can notice it's basically just hides and contracts when you go to the next item. Of course, not perfect compared to Stripe. It stays visible. You need a little more finesse with that. You need actual custom CSS, and I believe maybe some JavaScript with that one. There's, of course, some accessibility concerns that I'm not really taking advantage of here. You need to do like a drop down area attributes and all that stuff. I would add that if I were you, if this was going to a production environment, but right now this is just kind of show and tell, so take it with a grain of salt. But you notice I'm able to kind of hover over this and still keep it open, and then when I hover off, it's off. So it's a nice little thing. Awesome. So solutions is going to be fairly straightforward as well. I'll actually copy quite a bit of code here. In fact, we can go here, copy this whole div. I like to collapse it so it's easier to see. Come back up, paste that in, and that'll give us the same look and feel here, but I don't want to do a grid layout with this one. So I'll actually just remove everything here, do this collapsed view as well. And that gives me just a little drop down for now. This one will be way less in width as well. So let me go and adjust that to 260, I believe. I just dropped it a little bit. So now it's a smaller menu. The left definitely needs to come back to not being so far over there. Maybe that. There we go. And then the caret itself should come back left a lot. So we'll do that as well. Right here, we've got this huge translate X property. I'm going to go back and make it just, what should I make it? We'll start it at a little negative. And when we do the hover effect, we'll do 3. It gives us a little difference. So that one comes over. This one's a shorter span, so it's going to not come as far. Makes sense to me. And I believe we're close with that. The menu itself, I'm going to make a little fancy. It's just going to be UL class here. We'll do the same kind of menu. In fact, I can copy this one, the suite. I'm going to copy this one here, paste that, and then I'll come back and paste that one here. This one's going to be called use cases. Again, pretty much following Stripe's lead. And then the UL margin top 3, a little offset. We'll set the text to 15 here as well. Then each LI is going to have a link. And the link's going to be kind of boatloaded with some classes, but it's to make the effect look cool. So I'm going to actually make the text itself transparent, and we're going to add a background gradient to the text, so it's kind of got a a glamorous look and feel. So we'll say BG transparent. It's one of my favorite extensions of the library. You do the BG clip text class, and that makes sure you can actually use the background on text. And then we'll need to set text to transparent so it has no actual fill. But then we can, with those in place, we can say BG gradient like we would any other background to some container to bottom right. And then I'll just do like a kind of like our body background almost. So indigo 400, maybe a little lighter, to pink 700, and then via blue 500. Font semi-bold. Hover from blue 600. Hover, we'll kind of just do an invert on hover to indigo 600. Hover via pink 400. I'll set some padding and then make sure it's a block level item. So that gives us a look and feel like this. So when I hover over it, it has a different look. Let's see. Is it doing? Oh, that's why. Indigo. I think it should be fixed now. Let's see. BG clip text, gradient to bottom right, transparent. Creators is where I started, and I did streamers. I'm just thinking of different avenues this could be used. And influence. I'm literally spitting things out. Influence. And what else? Probably do handful more. Programming and design, perhaps. Awesome. All right, so that gives us a nice effect on hover. It's more of a gradient feel. So the next step would be the developers menu. Pretty straightforward as well. I'm going to make it another 2-column one. So I'll actually kind of give it similar properties as our products. So I'm going to close the solutions LI, open this one up. In fact, I'll copy this from the products dropdown, paste it just below. I'll replace this one there. Kind of close to what we want, not quite. Especially the anchor links, so I'll change those to touch. Big one here is to change that to documentation. So up here on before the grid, we'll say I want like a full, almost a full width one. I'll make that a anchor tag. And this will have a documentation text, and then we'll have P class in here, kind of mimicking what we did before with the other items, but a little bit different. So block P2, negative MX2, rounded large, hover BG gradient to bottom right, and then hover from indigo 50, hover to pink 50, and transition ease in out. Duration will be 300, a little quicker on this one. Text gray 800. And font semi-bold. Finally, hover will be text indigo 600. Pretty much copying what we did before, but I just wanted to type it out once more. Start integrating in no time. We'll change this to look a little different on hover, or just in general. So text gray 50, and then font normal. We don't want it to be bold. So we'll go here, developers, documentation's here. The text needs to be 500. There we go. All right, so then on the grid item, we'll actually do a little bit of offset here to make sure that's not touching. So right there, we've got the offset on the grid, and below that, I want to change it to get started instead. So get started. And these are going to be simpler. I don't want to go too fancy with these, so I'll just make them a one-liner, no subtext or anything like that. So class will be text gray 600, hover text gray 800, py1 block font normal. I'll change this to libraries and SDKs. And we'll pretty much follow suit down here for the A tags. So paste that down. This one I called plugins. And below that, we've got code samples. And finally, tutorials. Okay, so that gives us developers. We don't need the plugins part, so I'm actually going to make this, actually we do. I'm going to do guides here. And we'll pretty much copy these over just to save some time. So the li tags will become these li tags. That gives us more of a balanced look. And I'll just change these labels. Okay, there we go. So that's a little more plain Jane. Some icons here would certainly improve, you know, the look and aesthetic like Stripe does here, of course. They have tons of icons to choose from. So these are going to be just to show you the, you know, idea. But in general, that's looking pretty good. So now as you cycle through each one, we're getting closer and closer to where we need. Caret on this one's a little off, so why don't I adjust that a slight bit. Go way back up here to that triangle, or not triangle, a square. And this one will do like maybe 0.5 rim. There we go. It's a little more central. maybe a little even more. Finally, the resources tab will be quite similar to that. Just a basic drop down for that one like we did with one side of this equation. So why don't I'm going to copy everything in the developers drop down, paste it below on resources, and remove the grid. So right here, we'll get rid of that and that first div. Look for the other div here, get rid of that one. And then this last div we'll just remove completely. It's a little tough to navigate there. It looks like I forgot something here. In tag, looks like I might need one more div. Got a div here, div there. Maybe one too many. Yeah. All right. So the main menu is going to look like this now. We don't need this first documentation tab. Now it's just going to be basically a one-up version. So that's going to make our menu really considerably smaller. So we don't need to make sure the min width is so wide. So we can probably just go down to like 200 pixels. See what that does. Yeah, it's pretty... Wait, I'm on the wrong thing here. 200 pixels here. And the left offset should certainly be maybe 0. Maybe I'll do like -2 like I did on the one before. Might have been 4. That should do the trick. Now notice the arrow or the caret's way off, so we'll need to adjust that, of course. And I think that could be kind of what we did before with the solutions menu. Since it was a tighter width, we'll probably be able to do a negative to start and then come back with a positive to kind of give it the same effect. There we go. I believe that's close to it. What I want to change, of course, is this up. Get rid of that menu, get rid of this offset. And we'll just change this to get support. Blog. Just some generic resource links and maybe case studies if there are any. And guides. And maybe one more. News and events, something like that. All right, so that gives us the smaller menu, just basic links here, nothing fancy. And then we got our documentation, solutions, and finally our big mega nav part. So mega nav probably more or less means there is a nav and then there's a sub nav within the nav. I don't think those are much of a practice anymore. They're just not as usable as they should be. And 9 times out of 10, if you put that many things in a navigation, it's going to be clunky to use. So I think what Stripe has done here is honestly a little much. There's so much stuff that they have. It's accessible, but it's thrown at you. So I wish maybe they'd find another way to make that work. But the technique itself is pretty neat. So that's kind of what I've tried to get it in store with this guide. Hopefully it was useful to see and beneficial using Tailwind specifically. So that is it. I think we're going to wrap with that. I will publish this source code on GitHub and link to it in this blog or article and video. So check the description in the video and also my blog for that. It's web-crunch.com if you want to see more like this. From time to time, I'll do a lot of Tailwind stuff. Other times, it's other full stack stuff. So hopefully this was helpful. If you want to see more, let me know in the comments. All right, thanks.